Further east lies Boa Vista. Its name translates to beautiful view, and unlike Cape Verde itself, the island fully lives up to its title. Endless beaches stretch along the coastline. Soft dunes roll across the landscape. Many first-time visitors describe the strange feeling of standing in what looks like a desert while hearing waves crash nearby. The explanation comes from the wind. Dust from the Sahara regularly crosses the Atlantic and settles here, creating a visible reminder that these islands remain closely connected to the African continent despite being surrounded by ocean. Then there is Fogo, an island shaped almost entirely by fire. At its center rises Pico do Fogo, reaching approximately 2,829 meters above sea level and standing as the highest point in the entire country. From a distance, the volcano dominates the horizon like a massive dark pyramid. Unlike many volcanic peaks around the world, Fogo is still active. Its eruptions continue to reshape the island. The most significant recent event occurred between 2014 and 2015, when lava flows destroyed entire communities inside the volcano's caldera. For many places, such destruction might have marked the end. But Cape Verde has never been a place that gives up easily. People returned. They rebuilt. And they continued farming the fertile volcanic soil that had both sustained and threatened them. Today, vineyards and coffee plantations still grow within the caldera, surrounded by fields of hardened black lava that serve as reminders of the homes that once stood there. Santiago, the largest island in the archipelago, plays a different role. It serves as the political and economic center of the nation. The capital city, Praia, is located along its southern coast and offers a completely different atmosphere from many of the quieter islands. Government institutions, universities, businesses, the country's busiest port, all are concentrated here. Santiago is where much of modern Cape Verde continues to take shape. Yet it is also where some of the country's oldest stories remain visible. From the dry valleys of its interior to the historic streets of Cidade Velha, the island presents the past and present side by side. If Santiago represents the country's administrative heart, then São Vicente is widely considered its cultural soul. Its main city, Mindelo, has long been regarded as one of the most creative centers in the archipelago. Music drifts through seaside cafes. Public squares fill with conversation. Open-air performances bring people together long after sunset. It is here that many of Cape Verde's artistic traditions have flourished, helping shape the country's cultural identity for generations. And among those traditions, none carries more emotional weight than the music that would eventually introduce Cape Verde to the world. If São Vicente is the cultural heart of Cape Verde, then its capital, Mindelo, is where that heartbeat is heard most clearly. As evening settles over the harbor, music begins to spill from cafes, public squares, and small neighborhood gatherings. For Cape Verdeans, music is more than entertainment. It is memory, identity, and a way of preserving emotions that words alone often cannot express. Among all the country's musical traditions, none is more iconic than Morna. Its slow melodies carry a quiet sadness, blending African rhythms with European influences into a sound that feels unmistakably Atlantic. Every note seems to tell a story of departure, distance, and the hope of one day returning home. At the center of Morna lies a feeling Cape Verdeans describe with a single word: saudade. The term is often translated as homesickness, but its meaning reaches much deeper than that. It can describe longing for someone who left years ago, missing a place that exists only in memory, or feeling the absence of a time in life that can never truly return. For many Cape Verdeans, saudade is not simply an emotion. It is part of who they are. That feeling grew naturally from the country's history. For generations, drought, famine, and limited opportunities forced countless Cape Verdeans to leave their homeland in search of a better future. Today, the Cape Verdean diaspora is larger than the population living on the islands themselves. Large communities can be found across the United States, especially throughout New England, as well as Portugal and several other European countries. Families have spent generations living oceans apart while continuing to call the same islands home. Perhaps that is why themes of separation and reunion appear so often in Cape Verdean music. The nation's identity has never belonged only to those who stayed. It has always belonged equally to those who left, and never forgot where they came from. No one carried that story to the rest of the world more powerfully than Cesaria Evora. Born in Mindelo, she became the voice that introduced Cape Verde to millions of listeners across the globe. Known as the Barefoot Diva, she often performed without shoes, allowing her music, not appearance, to command the audience's attention. There was nothing extravagant about her performances. No elaborate stage effects. No dramatic spectacle. Only a voice filled with honesty, carrying generations of migration, longing, and Atlantic history in every song. Through Cesaria, people around the world experienced Cape Verde's emotional soul long before they ever learned where the islands were located. Yet Cape Verdean music is not defined by melancholy alone. Alongside Morna lives another tradition filled with movement and celebration. Funana. Where Morna slows the heart, Funana quickens it. Driven by the lively sound of the accordion and energetic rhythms, Funana transforms gatherings into celebrations. Its fast tempo invites dancing, laughter, and movement, offering the perfect balance to Morna's reflective mood. Then there is Batuk, one of the oldest musical traditions preserved on the islands. Rooted deeply in West African heritage, Batuk relies on layered percussion, rhythmic clapping, and call-and-response singing. It isn't music designed for concert halls. It belongs to communities, to neighbors gathered together, to shared moments where every voice becomes part of the performance. These traditions remind visitors that Cape Verde's culture was never borrowed from one place alone. It grew from many histories meeting on the same shores. Across the islands, one simple phrase appears almost everywhere. On shop signs. On t-shirts. In everyday conversations. No stress. For outsiders, it may seem like a tourist slogan. For Cape Verdeans, it reflects something much deeper. People here have lived with drought, isolation, and uncertainty for centuries. They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't stop the winds. They couldn't prevent famine or shorten the vast Atlantic separating them from the rest of the world. What they could control was their response. From that reality emerged a philosophy built on patience rather than panic. Acceptance instead of constant frustration. Finding peace within circumstances that could not always be changed. Don't rush. Don't waste energy complaining about what cannot be controlled. Hold on to whatever joy today still offers. That quiet outlook continues to shape daily life across the islands. Another word captures that same spirit. Morabeza. Although often translated simply as hospitality, the meaning goes much further. Morabeza is warmth, generosity, kindness shown without expecting anything in return. It is the genuine effort to make strangers feel welcome, even in a land where survival has never been easy. For centuries, Morabeza helped communities grow stronger despite limited resources. It became one of Cape Verde's greatest strengths. The country's national dish tells exactly the same story. Cachupa. A slow-cooked stew prepared with corn, beans, vegetables, and whatever ingredients happen to be available. There is no single perfect recipe. Each family prepares it a little differently. What matters is not luxury. It is making the most of what exists. Every ingredient contributes. Nothing is wasted. Hours of slow cooking transform simple foods into something far richer than the individual parts could ever become. In many ways, cachupa reflects Cape Verde itself. Different origins, different influences, gradually blending together until something entirely new emerges. That same resilience has shaped every generation of Cape Verdeans. Not because life here has been easy, but because they learned how to create strength from limitation. Cape Verde in the 21st century tells a story very different from the image many people still associate with these dry Atlantic islands. Today, this small nation is consistently recognized as one of the most stable democracies in Africa. Over the decades, peaceful transfers of power have become the norm rather than the exception, while democratic institutions have continued to grow stronger, even as many larger and wealthier countries have struggled with the same challenge. Education has remained one of the country's highest priorities since independence. As a result, literacy rates now rank among the strongest in the region, reflecting decades of steady investment in people rather than natural resources. Healthcare has followed a similar path. In 2024, Cape Verde achieved a remarkable milestone when the World Health Organization officially certified the country as malaria-free. It was the result of years of determined work to strengthen healthcare systems, improve disease prevention, and protect communities across all 10 islands. That same determination reached the global stage through football. When Cape Verde's national team qualified for the 2026 FIFA World Cup for the first time in its history, it marked far more than a sporting achievement. It became proof that a nation of fewer than 600,000 people with limited natural resources could compete on the world's biggest stage through preparation, belief, and resilience. The result reminded millions that size alone does not define potential. Cape Verde is also transforming the very forces that once made life so difficult. The constant Atlantic winds, the intense year-round sunshine, the same environment that once brought drought and hardship is now helping power the country's future. With ambitious renewable energy projects already underway, Cape Verde aims to generate roughly half of its electricity from renewable sources by 2030, reducing dependence on imported fuels while building a more sustainable future. Yet perhaps the country's greatest resource has never been found within its borders. It lives beyond them. Across New England, Lisbon, Rotterdam, Paris, and countless other cities around the world, generations of Cape Verdeans continue to maintain close ties with the islands their families once left behind. Many have lived abroad for decades. Some were born overseas. Yet the connection remains remarkably strong. Every year, money sent home by the diaspora supports families, strengthens local communities, and helps sustain the nation's economy. But those remittances represent something even greater than financial support. They symbolize an unbroken bond between a scattered people and the islands that continue to define them. It is a relationship that has endured across oceans and generations. Cape Verde proves something few places on Earth ever have the opportunity to demonstrate. A nation's identity does not always have to grow from thousands of years of ancient history. Sometimes, identity is created. These islands once had no permanent human population, no kingdoms, no indigenous civilization, no inherited national story. Yet the people who arrived here, whether by choice or by force, built one anyway. They created a language, a culture, a shared identity, and a nation unlike any other in the Atlantic. From the centuries-old streets of Cidade Velha, to the green mountain valleys of Santo Anteo, from the haunting melodies of Morna, to the relentless Atlantic winds that have shaped these islands for generations. Every chapter of Cape Verde tells the same story, a story of resilience, a story of adaptation, a story of people who refuse to let hardship define their future. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. Cape Verde was never truly made remarkable by its landscape. It was made remarkable by the people who looked at a harsh, unforgiving chain of volcanic islands and chose to call it home. They built a nation where none had existed. They created roots where there had been no ancestors. And in doing so, they proved that history is not only something people inherit. Sometimes, it is something they create. So here's a question for you. If you had arrived on these islands 5 centuries ago, with no family history, no established culture, and no past to rely on, what kind of society do you think you would have built? Weathered by centuries of wind and salt, they stand quietly beneath the tropical sun. Visitors often describe the silence here as feeling heavier than the heat itself. This was never just another trading town. It became one of the deepest scars in the history of human migration, a place whose past has never been erased or hidden from memory. Yet Cidade Velha was more than a center of commerce and forced displacement. It also became the birthplace of something entirely unexpected. A completely new identity. Not one inherited from ancient civilizations, but one created through the meeting of people who had never before shared the same homeland. The Portuguese arrived carrying their own language, religion, customs, and worldview. The Africans who came here, whether through forced labor, trade, or later settlement, brought with them music, traditions, farming knowledge, stories, and generations of cultural memory. Over the decades, these communities lived side by side. They worked together, raised families together, built homes together, and slowly created a future on islands that had once belonged to no one. From that extraordinary encounter emerged something the world had never seen before. A new Creole language known as Crioulo. It wasn't simply Portuguese mixed with African vocabulary, nor was it African grammar filled with Portuguese words. It became an entirely original language, shaped naturally by generations adapting to a reality unlike anywhere else on Earth. At the same time, a new mixed heritage society began taking shape. The Portuguese referred to these communities as mestiço, but over time the old divisions between European and African identities gradually faded. What emerged belonged completely to neither world. Instead, it belonged to Cape Verde. It was here, in this quiet valley on Santiago Island, that the foundations of modern Cape Verdean identity were first laid. Today, visitors can still walk those same stone streets. They can stand inside what is considered the oldest church in the tropics. They can explore the remains of coastal fortifications that have watched centuries of arrivals and departures unfold beneath them. Every wall, every street, every weathered stone carries the memory of a past that time has preserved instead of erasing. By the beginning of the 19th century, however, Cape Verde faced a crisis that would reshape its future forever. As international pressure slowly brought the transatlantic slave trade into decline, the ports that had once made these islands so important began losing their purpose. Ribeira Grande, once among the Atlantic's busiest harbors, gradually slipped into the quiet historic town visitors know today. At the same time, another disaster struck with devastating force. Drought. And again. And again. Crop failures became increasingly common. Famines swept across the islands throughout the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, claiming tens of thousands of lives. These weren't isolated catastrophes. They became part of everyday existence on land that had never been able to feed its growing population consistently. Faced with impossible conditions, many Cape Verdeans made the only choice left to them. They left. Large waves of migration spread across the Atlantic. Some settled in the United States. Others moved to different Portuguese territories. Many simply searched for any place that offered a better chance of survival than repeated famine at home. That migration transformed Cape Verde forever. Its people would eventually become known not only by those who remained on the islands, but also by the generations who built new lives thousands of kilometers away. Out of years of hardship, migration, and a growing sense of shared identity, a new political vision slowly began to emerge among Cape Verdeans. At the center of that movement stood a man named Amilcar Cabral. More than a political leader, Cabral became one of the most influential voices for self-determination in Portuguese Africa. His vision extended beyond Cape Verde alone. He believed Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, two Portuguese colonies connected by history and colonial rule, could pursue freedom together and build their futures side by side. Through speeches, organization, and political strategy, Cabral helped shape a movement that would eventually challenge centuries of colonial control. Although his influence continued to grow, he would never witness the final outcome of the struggle he helped lead. In 1973 he was assassinated, just 2 years before independence became reality. On July 5, 1975, Cape Verde officially gained its freedom, ending more than 5 centuries of Portuguese administration that had begun with the founding of Ribeira Grande in 1462. A new nation entered the world. Not a kingdom reclaiming ancient sovereignty. Not a state restoring a forgotten empire. Because no such past had ever existed on these islands. Instead, Cape Verde became something far rarer. A country built by people who had created an identity where none previously existed and who now had the opportunity to shape their future entirely on their own terms. But understanding Cape Verde means understanding that it is not a single landscape repeated across 10 islands. Each island carries its own personality, its own rhythm, its own story. Together they form a scattered Atlantic nation connected by history, culture, and the winds that never stop crossing the ocean. Traditionally, the archipelago is divided into 2 groups. The Barlavento Islands, or Windward Islands, lie to the north, directly exposed to the strongest Atlantic currents. To the south are the Sotavento Islands, often calmer and more sheltered from those same winds. Among the best known of the Windward Islands is Sal. Seen from the air, it appears like a ribbon of golden land surrounded by deep blue water. Rainfall here is scarce. Large parts of the island resemble a desert more than a tropical destination. Yet that same harsh environment helped create one of Sal's most valuable resources: salt. Over centuries, volcanic formations and evaporating seawater produced vast salt pans that became essential to local communities and regional trade. Even today, the brilliant white salt fields remain one of the island's most recognizable features, reflecting sunlight so intensely they resemble giant natural mirrors. There is a country in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean whose name promises something its landscape has almost never delivered. It is called Cape Verde, the Green Cape. A name that brings to mind dense forests, rolling green hills, flowing rivers, and fertile valleys. Yet stand on almost any of its 10 islands, and you'll be greeted by something completely different. Dry volcanic slopes. Dust-covered valleys. Rocky hills where even the toughest trees struggle to survive. For most of the year, this country wears the colors of drought, earthy brown, weathered gray, and the faded yellow of plants that have learned to live on almost nothing. The name was never meant to describe these islands. Instead, it was inherited from a green peninsula on the coast of present-day Senegal that Portuguese sailors passed before they ever reached this archipelago. A simple geographical misunderstanding that has survived for more than 5 centuries, still misleading travelers who arrive expecting a paradise the name seems to promise. But the greatest mystery of Cape Verde has nothing to do with its color, its climate, or the contrast between its name and its appearance. It has everything to do with its people. Before the 15th century, there is no evidence that anyone had ever lived here permanently. No villages. No fishing camps. No generations raised on these volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic. Cape Verde was one of the very few places on Earth with no indigenous population. Not because it was impossible to find, but because surviving here was difficult enough that no one had chosen to stay. Today, that once empty chain of islands has become one of the most stable democracies in Africa. A nation whose football team reached the FIFA World Cup. A nation whose people, without ancient ancestors rooted in this land, created an entirely new culture, a unique language, and an identity found nowhere else on Earth. This is the story of how a place with no recorded human history before 1462 became one of the most remarkable cultures in the Atlantic world. How isolation, drought, and centuries of hardship produced not hopelessness, but a philosophy of life that Cape Verdeans now carry with them to every corner of the globe. This is Cape Verde. 10 islands. No indigenous ancestors. And a culture built almost entirely by people who either chose, or were forced, to begin again. To understand why Cape Verde looks nothing like its name, you have to look beyond the islands themselves and toward the vast desert stretching across the African mainland. Cape Verde lies roughly 570 kilometers off the coast of Senegal, directly within one of the world's most important weather corridors. Many tropical systems that eventually grow into Atlantic hurricanes first begin organizing in these waters, drawing their earliest strength from conditions formed here. The same winds carry something else across the ocean. Fine dust from the Sahara Desert. Lifted high into the atmosphere, it drifts hundreds of kilometers before settling over the islands in a light brown haze, sometimes turning a clear blue sky into the color of faded gold. Geologically and climatically, Cape Verde is far from the tropical paradise many imagine. It is, in many ways, an extension of the African Sahel, a harsh semi-arid region simply pushed hundreds of kilometers into the Atlantic and surrounded by water instead of endless sand. Only around 1/10 of the country's land is suitable for long-term farming. For those who eventually settled these islands, drought has never been an occasional disaster. It has always been the normal state of life. The constant reality against which every harvest, every well, and every decision about where to build or plant has been measured. Even the country's name exists because of a historical mistake. Cabo Verde was borrowed from Cape Verde, the green peninsula on the coast of modern-day Senegal, the westernmost point of mainland Africa. Portuguese sailors passed that truly green cape before discovering these dry volcanic islands. Whether through confusion, convenience, or simple habit, the name remained. For more than 5 centuries, these islands have carried a label that never truly belonged to them. And yet, seen from above, Cape Verde possesses a beauty entirely its own. Not because it is green, but because 10 volcanic islands rise from the Atlantic like the peaks of an ancient submerged mountain range. The surviving summits of a world that disappeared beneath the sea long before human eyes ever witnessed it. This was the land European sailors encountered during the mid-15th century. Empty, harsh, unforgiving, and about to become one of the most important meeting places in the history of the Atlantic world. On the southern coast of Santiago Island, where a narrow valley opens between dry volcanic hills before meeting the Atlantic, lies a quiet town that today seems almost frozen in time. Stone-paved streets, low colonial houses, a dry stream winding silently between buildings that have stood for more than 500 years. Its name is Cidade Velha, the Old City. At first glance, it hardly looks like one of the places that changed the course of Atlantic history. Yet in 1462, Portuguese settlers established a town here known as Ribeira Grande. It became the very first permanent European settlement anywhere in the tropics. Not in Asia, not in the Americas, but here, on a remote volcanic island that less than 50 years earlier had never supported a permanent human population. Cape Verde's location placed it directly along the busiest sea routes of the age of exploration. Ships sailing from Europe to Africa, and later onward to the Americas, regularly stopped here to collect fresh water, restock supplies, and repair their vessels before continuing across the vast Atlantic. But those ships carried far more than food and cargo. They also carried one of history's darkest chapters. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Ribeira Grande became one of the Atlantic slave trade's most important transit ports. Men, women, and children taken from the coasts of West Africa were brought here before being forced onto ships bound for the Americas. For countless people, these islands became the final piece of African land they would ever see before an ocean crossing they had no choice but to endure. Today, the old stone fortifications still overlook the harbor. Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story changed the way you think about how cultures are formed, share it with someone who believes a nation's identity must always begin in the distant past. Because sometimes, the strongest roots are the ones people choose to grow. And next week we'll travel to another extraordinary place. A country that refused to surrender to disaster, reclaimed its land from the sea, and turned survival into one of history's greatest engineering achievements. We'll see you there.